I'm going to reveal to you the secret meaning of 9 of the most disturbing nightmares. They fall into 3 groups. The first group includes 3 nightmares that are unsettling. Then there are 4 nightmares that are downright terrifying, each one scarier than the next. And finally, we enter a different realm altogether, the realm of the uncanny, which is the scariest experience known to man. We'll explore 2 nightmares that are uncanny. One is a lot scarier than the other. For your sake, I hope that you never have this last nightmare. What you learn from this video will increase your understanding of nightmares 100-fold. It may even change your life. Okay, let's start with the least scary nightmare. Number 9. It's the familiar dream of finding oneself naked in public. Yeah, imagine walking around buck naked in Times Square in New York City. Whoa! Anyway, this nightmare is associated with shame, but not necessarily over anything that we might have done, but rather over the realization that other people can see who we really are, warts and all. They can see all of our imperfections, not in the physical sense, but rather our moral imperfections, our faults, failings, foibles, and character flaws. This is the curious thing. Other people got your number long ago. If you think you've been fooling anyone, forget about it. And so, you were naked in the sense of exposed to other people's perceptions about you long ago. It's just that one day you realize it. Yes, you realize that you've always been going around naked, so to speak. People have always been able to see behind your veneer. And how embarrassing it is to realize this. The philosopher Henri Bergson said that comical characters in plays and in films are those who everyone can see, but who are invisible to themselves. Think, for example, of Ralph Cramden, Lucy, George Costanza, or Homer Simpson. To be invisible to oneself means to lack self-knowledge. Well, the moment when you become visible to yourself, when you become self-aware, is the moment when you realize that you're naked. After all, what happens when Adam and Eve eat of the apple that makes them self-aware? The first thing is that they realize that they're naked, and then they wish to conceal their nakedness. These embarrassing dreams are trying to tell you something. First of all, they're telling you that if you could see yourself as others see you, you'd be embarrassed. So if you don't wish to be embarrassed, then clean up your act and be a better person. But there's another thing that this dream is telling you. It's saying to you, in effect, look, you can't go through life wearing your heart on your sleeve. You have to cover up to conceal yourself to a large degree. You can be out there for others, engaging with them, but you also have to attain inwardness. You need to gain an inner resting place, safe from public opinion. Indeed, safe from the eyes of others, a fortress of solitude where selfhood can be cultivated. And I think that the dream, where you're naked in public, is telling you that's what you need. And one last thing. Sunglasses are fine to some degree. They can shield you from what Jean-Paul Sartre called the look of the other, the look that makes you into an object or a thing. But sunglasses are no substitute for genuine inwardness. And now for dream number 8. Remember, we're counting down, Dave Letterman style. This nightmare is about one's teeth falling out. Sigmund Freud thought it had to do with the fear of impotence. Well, he was right and wrong about that. It has to do with impotence, but not in the sexual sense. It actually has to do with impotence, but in another sense altogether. Let me explain. Are you in the midst of a life transition? Many of us are. If you really start to become a different person, you'll find that you'll acquire certain new abilities and powers, but that you'll also lose some of the powers that you had previously relied upon. For example, the ability to get people to feel sorry for you is a sort of power, a neurotic one, but a power all the same. And the ability to never be in self-doubt, to never have any hamstringing inner questions, is another power. Anyway, when you begin to change and mature, the powers that you've been using all your life can't serve you any further. And because of that, you'll feel a sense of impotence, which is symbolized by your teeth falling out. It makes sense, for your teeth are the tools that you use to break down and incorporate the world into yourself, to transform what's out there into you. The fear of losing your teeth is therefore the fear that you'll be unable to be in the world effectively. In other words, it's the fear that you'll starve to death. Of course, we forget that in losing our old powers, the ones that we outgrew, we gain new, more effective powers. But when we're focused on the powers that we're losing, we have the anxiety dream that we're losing our teeth. But the fact that we dream of losing our teeth is a good sign. It means that we've been through some serious changes. Dream number 7 is about being late for an exam. In most cases, it involves an exam that you would have taken years ago. That's what's curious about this dream. You may have, for example, graduated high school 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, and yet you dream that you're anxiously running off for an exam and you're going to be late. And if it's not an exam, it's a class that you're required to take. And you might, for example, not be able to remember the combination of your locker, which is where you keep your textbooks. And here again, the clock is ticking and you're going to be late. And so, how is it that 30 years can pass and you're still anxious about the same exam, even though you passed it 30 years ago? Well, you see, the dream is symbolic. You're anxious because you feel inadequate to face your current situation in life, and so you attribute your feelings of inadequacy over not having acquired certain skills and competencies when you were younger. What sort of competencies? Are you late, for example, for a history exam? Or is it a math exam? Or is it a French language exam? Or if you were in the military, it could be a riflery exam. Each skill has a certain symbolic meaning, and it would behoove you to explore what it is, but we won't go into it right now. But there is something more, though, that this dream points to. It might have been the psychologist C.G. Jung who said that a characteristic of modern life is the lack of powerful rites of passage. Marriage, for example, used to be one such rite of passage, but it lost its efficacy to transform a person. Consequently, we don't feel quite ready for many of the burdensome responsibilities of modern existence. I think that many people today seek to go on a rugged adventure in the hope of gaining a transformative experience, one that would be a surrogate for a rite of passage. Sometimes it can work, and maybe that's why there are so many road trip movies. And now we go from unsettling dreams to terrifying dreams. But first, a short message from our sponsor. Greetings, I'm Dr. Mark Dillof, and I offer philosophical counseling for all of life's challenges. And I also offer management consulting and career counseling. Anyway, terrifying dream number 6 involves monsters. It's hard to generalize about monster dreams because each monster has a different meaning. For example, did you ever have a dream that your house or bed was infested with large and disgusting insects of all sorts? It's sort of a monster dream. What does it mean? I'm not a Freudian, but I do think that insect dreams have to do with sexuality, more particularly illicit sexuality. What, though, is the connection with insects? I think subconsciously we think of insects as pullulating, in other words, as reproducing wildly. From the standpoint of moral consciousness, we find that repulsive. Also, insects inhabit the earth, and so, not surprisingly, we refer to illicit sexuality as dirty or salacious. That is why, if during the day your mind is on illicit or licentious sexuality, you may find yourself dreaming of insects, for your spirit is punishing you for degrading it. Have you ever had a nightmare about bears? I have when I was a child. You know, Russia is often represented as a bear, and she is called Mother Russia. That should offer you a clue to the whole affair. The bear often symbolizes the threatening aspect of the mother. What's that you say? Your mother was sweet and kindly? Psychologically speaking, a sweet mother can be very threatening, for she can threaten a child's independence by luring him into wanting to be taken care of. Snakes are an interesting type of monster. In the Garden of Eden myth, a snake tempts Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Indeed, if you've ever had a significant epiphany and insight into yourself about life, you might have a dream about a snake. Do you remember the monolith in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey? A snake in a dream is like that. It's an announcement by the unconscious that because of what you've seen, the insights that you've gained, that you've reached a new level of awareness. It kind of puts you on notice, so to speak. Okay, but why a snake? Well, have you ever heard of the Ouroboros? It's an ancient symbol found all over the world. It's an image of a snake swallowing its own tail. Its circular nature is an image of completeness, of the circle of life forever consuming itself and yet staying whole. In my opinion, a snake, symbolically speaking, is a broken circle, a broken Ouroboros. And so, this is the interesting thing. For something new to emerge, the circle must be broken. Wholeness must be sacrificed if something new is to emerge. And what emerges, in your case, if you have a deeper insight into life, is a new level of consciousness, a new level of living, really a new life. That's what a life transition is really about. Why then is a snake dream frightening? Yeah, I know that a snake can bite you and sometimes even kill you because of its venom. But it's more than that. A snake is frightening because consciousness is frightening. And why is consciousness frightening? It's because we cling to who we are. And like a child, we say, I don't want to grow up. Well, anyway, there's a lot of other monster dreams. I've only mentioned a few just to give you a taste of the possibilities. And so, now we move on to nightmare number 5. Notice how each one gets more and more dreadful. Nightmare number 5 is about being trapped. It's an obvious metaphor. Yes, we all make choices that we regret, and then we feel trapped by our choices. And you know, it's funny, but in a certain respect, the feeling of being trapped nightmare is the opposite of the snake nightmare. For you see, at a certain point in your life, you're called upon to break free to a new level of consciousness and a new level of living. But if you don't, you will feel trapped or stuck by your situation in life. Sometimes you will feel stuck or trapped by your job, by your marriage, or whatever. Although ultimately it's not your job or your spouse that's to blame, but you yourself. And your feeling of being stuck will appear in your dreams as being trapped. For example, in a house or maybe in a tunnel. Sometimes you might feel trapped in a kind of maze, and that could take the form of a house with many rooms or some other kind of labyrinth which you run through trying to find a way out. In the case of the maze nightmare, you feel that there's an exit, but you just don't know where it is, so you run desperately through the labyrinth of life. Would you like to find a way out of the maze that you're in? Then turn inward and listen to the wisdom of the serpent, the wisdom that tells you that the way out of the maze is to elevate your consciousness. You could, in other words, create wings of thought. And like Daedalus from Greek mythology, rather than running through the labyrinth, you can fly out of it. That's real transcendence. And now we'll explore an even more terrifying nightmare, that of falling. The underlying terror symbolized by falling is that of existential groundlessness. A ground is a meaning and purpose in life, something that we regard as being of ultimate importance. It's a ground because it holds you up. It supports you so that you don't go spinning through the void. Anyone who hasn't undergone a crisis of meaning at least once in his or her life hasn't really fully blossomed as a person. Ever see the Roadrunner cartoon? Do you remember how Wile E. Coyote runs off the edge of a cliff? The funny thing is that he's okay until he looks down. Then he goes plunging into the abyss. And that's so true of life. We think that we have a ground, in other words, a meaning or purpose, until we dare to look down. In other words, until we dare to examine our life. It's then that we realize that we have no ground and that we too go plunging into the abyss. That's the real underlying anxiety of those nightmares about falling. Let's say, for example, that you were married many years and found meaning in being a good husband or wife, but then you discover that your spouse has cheated on you. That could lead to a sense of existential groundlessness. Similarly, someone you love gets sick. You pray to God, but it seems like your prayers have gone unheard. You then feel like your life is without meaning, without foundation. And so you have a nightmare about plunging into the abyss and how frightening it is. If your sleep has been troubled by dreams of falling, what then to do? Well, you can gain a foundation, in other words, an ultimate meaning or purpose in life. Of course, that's easier said than done. You could also seek to transcend the very category of meaning, purpose, and ground altogether, like a Buddhist. Yes, instead of seeking a ground, you can embrace the void. But that, too, is no mean feat. Moving on, nightmare number 3 is about being pursued, and a terrifying nightmare it is. If you have such a nightmare, then the ultimate question is, what is it, essentially, that is pursuing you? Is it your past? It may very well be. Is it nemesis, the dark consequences of the mistakes that you've made due to your fatal flaw? Is it your demons that are pursuing you? It could be. Or it could be more than that. Have you ever read Francis Thompson's poem, The Hound of Heaven? The protagonist of that poem is being pursued by God and is trying to flee him. Sometimes one's flight takes the form of what the psychologist Abraham Maslow called the Jonah complex. In that biblical tale, God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh to tell the people there to repent for their sins. But Jonah flees his mission and is pursued by God. As the boxer Joe Louis once said about an opponent, he can run, but he can't hide. If you remember, in the dream of falling, you find yourself without an ultimate ground, without an ultimate meaning. But in this dream of being pursued, you do have the possibility of attaining a meaning and purpose in your life. But you flee it, for you fear it. We flee the advent of meaning because we dread what it will call upon us to do and the responsibilities involved with it. More ultimately, we are running from ourselves, from our own higher possibilities. Quite often, that's what the dream of being chased is about. Are you in flight? If so, what are you running away from? Is it from yourself? And now, my friends, we leave those nightmares that are terrifying to arrive at nightmares that are even scarier, if that's possible. We enter the realm of the uncanny. Freud said quite rightly that there is nothing more frightening than the experience of the uncanny. In one of his books, he examined the etymology of the German word for the uncanny. Freud said that the uncanny in German literally means not being at home. Here we find two nightmares that evoke the sense of not being home. They are related to each other, although the second one is a lot scarier than the first. Nightmare number 2 is about being lost. In such a dream, one is walking or driving along, and one ends up in a strange, unfamiliar place. We have such nightmares when we're charting unfamiliar territory, psychologically speaking, and the lay of the land is unfamiliar to us. It seems strange and alien. I myself have had many a disturbing nightmare like this, some of which were mildly unsettling, while others were downright terrifying. This sort of dream indicates that we aren't stuck or trapped. No, that's a different dream, one we already discussed. And we aren't in flight, like Jonah. That's also another dream which we've discussed. No, rather in this nightmare, we find ourselves terrified by virtue of having finally ventured into the unfamiliar, into what the bard called the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns. And maybe the terror is that we won't return home again. If you find yourself in the realm of the uncanny, you might be wondering how you got there. In other words, how did you end up in this undiscovered country? Certain insights into life that you may have gained can be the seeds of these nightmares. Ironic, isn't it? Yes, often the reward for spiritual progress is a nightmare. Indeed, it's often the case that the reward for heroism is even greater opportunities for heroism. The thing to do when your dreams tell you that you're not in Kansas anymore is not to panic. Don't desperately seek to run home again and grab your coffee cup or the remote of your TV or anything else that stabilizes you, unless you just have to regain your psychological stability by doing what's habitual and familiar. Yeah, it's okay to rest and try to get some type of grounding when you have to, but ultimately, you have to acknowledge that in this life of ours, we have no permanent home. Rather, as human beings, we are wayfarers. Now we come to nightmare number 1. It is a far more terrifying variation of the being lost nightmare, and it's not just redolent of the uncanny as in the last dream. No, this is full tilt boogie uncanny. Imagine this sort of dream. You return home one day, maybe from a trip somewhere, but find your home to be oddly unfamiliar. There's something strange about it, but you can't quite put your finger on it. You see the people whom you know, your acquaintances, friends, family, but they seem strangely different in an odd sort of way that you can't quite grasp. Or it might not be people who look different, but things such as tables and chairs, the train that you take to work every day, or your house. I'll give you an example of the feeling. When I was a child, I grew up in a 6-story brownstone apartment in Brooklyn. It was part of a complex with about 20 6-story apartment houses that looked identical to mine. I remember getting lost one time and finally thinking that I had found my apartment house, with much relief. But I remember a moment later thinking that something didn't look right. I felt a queasy feeling, the type of feeling that one gets when one encounters the uncanny. And then I realized, no wonder the house didn't look quite right. That's because it wasn't my apartment house. It was another apartment house. This wasn't a dream, but an actual experience. But I've had dreams like that. Similarly, in Alfred Hitchcock's film, The Lady Vanishes, the protagonist thinks that he has found the missing Miss Froy. He's relieved. He sees her from behind, but when she turns her head, it turns out to be another woman. And then there's a phenomenon in the field of robotics called the uncanny valley. It means basically that people like robots to look like human beings, but at a certain point, if the engineers design a robot that looks too much like a human being, people begin to experience that certain queasy feeling associated with the uncanny. You see, it's one thing to find oneself lost and not able to find your home. Yeah, that's nightmare number 2. But it's much more terrifying, though, when home itself seems strange and unfamiliar. Yeah, that's nightmare number 1. What exactly is it, then, that has made your home seem odd and strange? What has made the familiar seem unfamiliar? The advent of self-awareness, a deeper understanding of who you are, who others are, and what life is all about, is what makes you see home with new eyes, such that you no longer see it as you had been seeing it. It's not that your home has changed, it's not that the world has changed, it's that you've changed. The uncanny, then, is the unreality of what you normally take to be reality. And the feeling of unreality is the feeling of strangeness. And if you ever have a dream that evokes the uncanny, you will know it. You may wake up feeling that your bedroom is spinning around. You'll find yourself grabbing your bedpost and holding on for dear life as you start screaming. From my experience, such nightmares tend to be rather short. It's even worse, though, if you have such experiences not merely in a dream, but in waking life. The good news is that such experiences can often be harbingers of self-realization, self-awakening, and enlightenment. Oh, and one last thing. The fact that you viewed this video has increased the likelihood that you'll have nightmare number 1. Sorry, I guess I should have warned you. And now we reach the conclusion of this video. Let me ask you a rhetorical question. What is anxiety? I ask you this because all nightmares are a product of anxiety. We might say that anxiety is the perception of our unreality, our nothingness, our failure to achieve selfhood. Here again, paradoxically, anxiety and the nightmares that anxiety engenders is sometimes the reward for having done serious reflection and for having achieved a higher level of awareness. Not always, but sometimes. Yeah, some reward. But anxiety and nightmares need not be the last stage in our journey through life. Rather, nightmares and all that frightens us are part of the road we travel to inner peace. This may surprise you, but it's true. What we dread most in life is self-knowledge. That's what evokes a great many nightmares, including those that are uncanny. But your nightmares, although often terrifying, can be your teacher and can take you where you need to go, if you let them. So be fearless. There are actually thousands of different types of dreams and nightmares. We just explored some of the most common. And finally, remember that the ultimate purpose of dreaming is to awaken.